Hi, I'm Bob Ostrom. I'm a children's book illustrator, and today we're going to do a watercolor. So I've got this little picture of a puppy here. We're going to just go ahead and start working on him a little bit. So the first thing I do when I'm doing watercolors, I always have like a little piece of paper next to me so that I can check out my colors to make sure I got them right before they go down, because pretty much when you're doing watercolors, once the color is down, that's where it's going to stay, and there's not a lot of chance to go back and get it a second time. So I'm going to load up my brush with a little bit of water and get my paint mixed up here. So I'm using a little bit of brown and some yellows here. That looks about right. I'm just going to go ahead and paint right in here. I want to make sure that I have enough water on my brush to cover this whole area, because I don't want to stop and go back. Otherwise I'll get some weird lines in here. Okay, and you'll notice that if I can find a place to stop like this, the bottom of this head, that's a good place, just in case I'm not able to get back to it again. So what I want to do now, I got a nice smooth wash here. I'm not going to go back into this one. I'll go back over here and start working on this piece right here. So I want to make sure I got plenty of paint and water on my brush to finish up that one up there too, because I want to make a nice smooth wash. So you notice that I painted over the spot. I'll come back to that later and paint that in again. Okay, that looks pretty good. So let's go ahead and start up here at the top, and we'll work our way down. Okay, and working with watercolors, we always work light to dark. Okay, because once the color is down, there's really no way to lighten it up. You can try lifting it up with a paper towel if you re-wet it, but for the most part, once the pigment's on the paper, that's pretty much where it's going to be. Okay. Stay nice and loose here. Okay, got a nice smooth wash, and we're just sort of laying our colors in there. Okay, so I'm going to take a quick break and let this dry. I'll be right back. Okay, so now that my painting is dry, I'm going to go ahead and get back in here and do a couple other little shapes. The reason I let it dry is because I don't want the colors to bleed together. So if you put a wet color next to a wet color, what happens is they start to merge together. And I didn't want the darker colors to blend into my lighter colors. So I'm going to go ahead and just paint out some of these other guys. I'm going to do his nose and his tongue and his collar here. So let's get a nice sort of purplish blue color for his nose. So when I'm mixing colors that I know are going to be dark, or we want to do in like a black, I'll hit this color twice. So the first time I do it is a light wash, and that'll put in a little bit of pigment for my highlight, and then I'll come back in again and I'll hit that one more time, and then this time I'll go darker. So right now I'm just painting for the highlight in that dark area there. And I can take a little bit of a paper towel and just sort of blot that out just a little bit. Okay. Now I'm going to go down and fill in a color for his tongue. Let me switch brushes because I don't want to get any black in there. Okay. So let's get a nice pink here. Again, I'm always going to test it out just before I put it on my paper. That looks about right. Okay, and we're just going to fill that in here. That's nice. And if I wanted to do a little bit of a gradation on it, I can just put a little bit more of the paint down at this end while it's still wet. And you can see how, as I dab that in, it'll start to spread itself out just a little bit. Okay, I'm going to paint the spot in on his back and the spot next to his eye. So I'm going to take a little bit of purple, which is a nice color, a nice shadow color for browns. I'm going to mix that in with my brown here. So I want to be careful not to do too much yellow with the purple. We want to go a little bit redder. Okay, so I'm going to take this brown right here, just a touch of purple. That looks about right. I'm going to go ahead and fill in this spot back here. Sometimes if my brush is a little bit too wet, I'll just dab it off before I go back in. Okay, and once I get that shape in there, then I can go back here and just throw a little more color on top of it. And because it's got an edge to it, it'll hold that pigment in and hold it in place without bleeding around too much. Now, if it was wet on the outside, it would just sort of spread out. Okay, but since the rest of the drawing is dry, it'll stay in place. Okay, and let's do a little bit of brown up near his eye. Give him a spot next to his eye. Okay, looks about right. We'll fill in this shape here. Just like this. That looks good, and then just pull that up a little bit like that. Looks good right there. Dab in a little bit of color down here. Okay, and then maybe we'll make one of his ears a little bit darker. So I'm going to use this reddish brown color for that. Mix that with a little bit of the darker brown. Okay, and I always test them out first. We'll make this one right here, that color, kind of matching his spot. And that was a little wet going on there, so I'm just going to dry it out just a hair. Smooth that around like that. There we go. Okay, so I think we can do his collar next. And I think we're going to make that, how about if we do that in a blue color? The trick with working with watercolors is just to make sure that you have the right amount of water on your brush and in your paints. And I felt like that brush is a little thick maybe for that job, so let's grab a thinner one here. Take these two colors and mix them together. A little bit more of that. That looks good. So let's go ahead and fill in this collar spot right here. We want to be careful not to get it too close to that pink, because I think the pink might still just be a little wet, so we don't want those two to mix together. Okay, that looks pretty good, and I can use a little bit of purple in there on top of that blue to give me a little bit of shadow up in there. Okay, so let's take a second to let that dry, and I'll be right back. Okay, we're back. So we've got this guy dried off a little bit here. I'm going to lay in a few more dark colors here on his nose, and then I'll throw a little bit of background color in there, and then we can do my favorite part, which is the line work. So when you're doing watercolors, your best friend is going to be your paper towel. So make sure you start each project with a little bit of paper towel handy, because then you can always rescue your drawing if anything goes wrong by picking up some of the extra paint with your paper towel. Okay, so we want to get his nose color in here. I believe we're going to do a little bit of purple and a little bit of black, throw in a little bit of blue on top of that. So let's see what we got here. A little bit more black. That looks about right. So let's go ahead and fill that in. And we're going to leave this space right here as a highlight. Okay, so this comes around like this. Okay, and because this is dry, it's holding my shape nicely. So I want a little thin line up top here. And I'm just going to sort of push the pigment down to the bottom part right about here. And that'll be the darker part of that nose. Okay, there we go. That looks pretty good. So when the pigment is wet, you can sort of push it around and sort of pull it into the spots that you want it. If you want to add a little more, just throw a little pigment on there and sort of dab it at the part that you want. As long as it's wet, it'll be nice and smooth. Okay, and I need a little bit of blue right down in that collar thing right there, the dog tag. And then I'm going to put just a little bit of background color behind this guy. So let's get some green. Maybe we can throw a little bit of yellow in with that green. That looks about right. So I'll just kind of move that around down here. We don't have to be too specific with that. Just a hint of green is fine down there. We'll have it be stronger where he is underneath his feet, and then we'll kind of fade out by sort of pulling that around. And as long as it's wet, I can just sort of dab back in here and move things around a little bit. Okay, and as I get closer towards the edges, you'll notice I'm drying my brush, and that means that the reason I'm doing that is to try and gradate this out just a little bit. So I'm just picking up a little bit of the pigment off of the brush and moving it around. Okay, and how about if we throw just a little blue around the top of them there? Okay, so I just throw this around here like that. Again, nothing too specific. Just gives us a hint of where he is. Okay. That looks pretty good. So if we wanted to, we could go back in over the top of this and put a few more washes in and maybe throw a little bit more shadow in here. But I kind of like where it is right now. So I'm going to take a break and I'm going to let this dry off, and we'll be right back to do our line work. So now that our paint is dry, it's time to do our line work. This is one of my favorite parts. I'm going to go ahead and just put his eyes in there. There's his nose right there. And a big smile for this guy. So I'm doing all my detail work with a thinner pen, and then once I get through with this, I'll switch over to my brush pen and do the big outlines here. And that way I can throw a little bit more line weight into it. There we go, just like that. It's important, again, on this paper, if you're using a brush pen, to pull your strokes, because this paper has a lot more texture to it, and this little thin tip will get stuck, and sometimes it'll give you a little bit of a mess if you don't. So just making sure that I go with the brush here. Okay. Very nice. Pull that right around there like that. Now, when I get to the end, if I wanted to, I could go back into this drawing with a little bit of colored pencil and touch up some of my colors or add a little bit more to it. But I think this looks great just the way it is, so I'm going to keep it like this. Okay, let's pull this guy around like that. And I'm not too worried about my pencil lines because this brush is, or this brush pen I should say, is nice and thick. So that'll cover up everything. And if I get to the end and there are still a few stray little pencil lines, I don't mind too much. But if you get fussy about that stuff, you could go back into this with a kneaded eraser and remove some of those lines. But I think this looks fine just the way it is. There we go. if you're going to do your pen lines first, make sure that you use a waterproof ink, because the last thing you want to do is try to paint something with water on top of pen that will bleed, because that'll just wreck your drawing and your painting at the same time. There we go. And these pens right here that I'm using are not going to do too well with water on top of them. So that's why I do the inking last. There we go. Right there like that. I'll just throw in a few little motion lines. This little guy's real happy and he's wagging his tail. Okay. I'm just going to add a little bit of line weight here and there, and then we should be all set. Okay, and there you have it. Thanks for joining me. My name is Bob Ostrom. If you'd like to see more, please visit my website at bobostromstudio.com or check out my DVD on how to draw animals.